Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk for 15 minutes, I hope, no longer. I'll round get me that. If I go on too long, I'm also prepared to answer questions. The Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War.
You can do without the mic. I think you without the mic is better. Just project a little bit.
Okay. The Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War was formed in 2003 during the build-up to the Anglo-American attack on Europe. And in the last 14 years, we've never had to change the name because since the so-called War on Terror was declared by the former President George W. Bush of the United States, we've lived in a state of permanent war. The world has lived in a state of permanent war for 16 years. Bush's war on terror is, in our view, a war of terror against the people, mostly Muslims and Arabs who live in the global south. It's a war to access and to appropriate their energy resources mainly. And it's not because the United States needed these energy resources, it's because the control of the energy resources of the world is a way of controlling the world, dominating the world. If you have your hand on the tap to the energy resources to China, to Europe, to Japan, you control their economies. So, our belief is that it's the duty of Canadians to resist in every way the participation of Canada and the Canadian government in this state of permanent war, a state of illegal wars against sovereign states in what we used to call the Third World, and today we call the Global South. We are strong supporters of international law and the concept of national sovereignty, but we are strong opponents of something called humanitarian interventionism. That is a school of thought. I'll deal with it a little bit later. That tries to that entered a new facet in international law at the UN, which gave powerful, rich, northern, advanced capitalist countries the belief that they could intervene in these wars to protect the human rights of people in these countries. It's something like the white man's burden. And that's the first occasion of that was in Libya. Disastrous results. The Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War is one of the few remaining active peace organizations in Canada since the demise of the Canadian Peace Alliance, which was the umbrella group for 165 peace organizations. The Canadian Peace Alliance frittered away about 2 years ago and has not been reconstituted as yet. And the reason that the Canadian Peace Alliance had a premature death, and the reason that we have that the governments in the West, NATO governments, Canada, the United States, Britain, France, etc., are able to get away with these illegal wars around the world is because of the gullibility of people in the Western left and ordinary people on the street in the narrative of the human rights narrative of the U.S. empire. In my first slide here, I'm showing you something that happened in the last week. And it was the lifting of the siege by the Syrian Arab Army of a city, the last major city in Syria in the hands of ISIS. The siege was over 3 years. The Syrian Arab Army and the people of Deir ez-Zor held out in a certain part of the city and province of Deir ez-Zor for 3 long years. It's one of the longest military sieges in the world. And just this week, the Syrian army came barreling across from western Syria to eastern Syria and liberated the city. And it marks basically the end of the U.S. regime change, or attempted regime change operation in Syria. The government of Syria now controls 85% of its own territory. There's only a corner in the northeast of Syria where the United States has built some 8 illegal military bases on Syrian soil and is trying to partition Syria into a Syrian state and a Kurdish state. So I've been working to support, and we've been working to support the Syrian government and the Syrian people in their fight to end this military intervention in Syria. And you will be probably unpleasantly surprised to know the Canadian government under Harper strongly supported the regime change, U.S. regime change in Syria with your tax money and using your diplomats, your diplomatic service, and your military and your I guess you would call it the espionage service. And so ceases. So and unfortunately, the Trudeau government hasn't changed anything. The Trudeau government has not cut off the sanctions Canada has put on Syria. The Trudeau government has not reopened diplomatic relations with Syria. It hasn't changed anything. So I'm glad to say that the Syrian people have succeeded in throwing out these foreign mercenaries, who were funded by the United States, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Canada, NATO, and so on, and that the war is coming to an end. But in that war, nearly 500,000 people were killed, of which about more than 100,000 were Syrian soldiers and police officers. And 12 million people, which is an incredible amount, 12 million people were turned into displaced persons. 4 million of them became refugees. And some of the people who get into these flimsy boats, make it up to Turkey and try and cross the Aegean Sea to Greece. The other 6 or 7 million are the internally displaced people inside of Syria. And it's interesting to note that these people do not run away from government-held areas to the areas held by these terrorist mercenaries funded by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United States, Britain, France, Canada. They flee to government-held areas where they are treated, where their kids get shelter, food, education, medical care, and housing. So the situation is that the war is coming to an end, but and I'm glad of that. This is in my lifetime. I've been involved since the war in Vietnam, and it's only been 2 or 3 times that the U.S. empire has actually been defeated. Vietnam, and there's one place. Another place was Lebanon in 2006, when the Israeli army tried to invade Lebanon but was turned back by the Hezbollah, and now Syria. So I personally feel very good that the Syrian people are winning this fight. I was in Syria last April, not this April 2016. This is Palmyra, one of the World Historic Sites, a UNESCO site. These are the Roman ruins from 2,000 years ago. They're part of the common heritage of humanity. And when ISIS got in there, these foreign terrorists funded by the West and Arab monarchies, they blew up a number of these temples and the Arch of Triumph. And we were I'm proud to say, that's me on the right. We're proud to say that we were the first tourists back up in this site, which was a very major tourist attraction in Syria and part of its tourist industry. Unfortunately, a few months later, ISIS recaptured the town for about 2-3 months, and until they were driven out again by the Syrian Arab army, and they blew up even more of the things you see in that picture that are part of our common human heritage. And that's because these sectarian terrorists are guided by the philosophy of the Saudi monarchy or by Al-Qaeda. What their view is that only the people who follow the Saudi Arabian brand of Islam, which most people don't even consider a form of Islam, it's so archaic and twisted and deviant, that they routinely kill anybody who disagrees with them, anybody of a different sect, and beheading them and in all kinds of horrible ways, which they videotape while they're doing it and post on YouTube. And if you want to see some really gross, you probably don't want to see, but they're there on YouTube. So these ruins did not represent the views of the Wahhabi monarchy in Saudi Arabia, so they felt that they should destroy them. I wrote a booklet about my time in Syria, and it was published as a print booklet, but we've sold it out, and we're not publishing anymore. And you can get it online at Amazon, Kobo, and iTunes. Define Syria, it's about $3. When I was in Syria, I want to point out that you're humanists and you believe in that, as I understand it from this petition here, that religion really has no place in government. You'll be interested to know something that most Canadians don't know, and that is that Syria is a secular state. There is no official religion. Syria is also very much like Canada because it's a pluralist country. There are many, many different national groups that live in Syria and have lived in Syria for thousands of years peacefully together. Kurds, Assyrians, Arabs, Druze, etc., etc., etc. And there's many religions in Syria. There are Christians. In fact, the Christian community in Syria is one of the oldest in the world. There were Jews until the fighting started. There are Sunni Muslims, there are Shia Muslims, there are Alawi Muslims. And they all got along fine under the Syrian Arab Republic because the Syrian government was strictly secular, did not favor any religion, or you had no religion, it didn't matter. And when we were there, this is Patriarch Gregorius III of the Greek Catholic Melkite Church, very influential with millions of followers. He was one of the two religious leaders. Pardon me? Two religious leaders we met, heads of large communities. And there was an election going on while we were there, parliamentary elections in Syria. We had an audience with him, our delegation, and then he led a parade through the old city of Damascus, went from church to church, and people came out of their churches and joined him, and they marched to vote in the election. And they were voting for the Syrian government, and he encouraged everybody in the country to vote for the government because the government of Syria is a secular government that guarantees the freedom of religion, or no religion, to all the people of Syria. So I thought that might be of interest to you, since in the Canadian mainstream media, you would never learn that. Never, ever. If you want to read one good book, this is the best book. This is the book the book that's come out about the war in Syria. I'm proud to say it's a Canadian that wrote the book. Stephen Gallant of Ottawa. He's a political commentator. You can Google him. He has a blog. The book's name is Washington's Long War on Syria, It's an excellent book, and it explains the whole history behind the war and the war. So, and I have 2 copies of it here. We're selling them for $25. Excellent book. Other things besides Syria that our coalition has done is we've always been supporters of Palestine, and we believe that the Palestinian people have unfairly been dispossessed and ethnically cleansed from their homes in Palestine. There's an event coming up. This one is the one in Hamilton. It's the Nakba Tour, and it's coming to Waterloo as well. An 85-year-old woman who was 14 at the time in 1947 when she and her family were ethnically cleansed from Palestine, was on a tour with a 23-year-old assistant, and they're speaking in all the major cities of the United States and Canada, and they are coming to Waterloo in the first week of October. I don't know the details, but you can Google it. So, when Israel had its attacks on Gaza, where it's like shooting fish in a barrel, they just went in and bombed the people living, the defenseless people of Gaza in 2014, 2012, and 2008. We had huge demonstrations in Hamilton, along with the huge demonstrations all over the world, protesting the Israeli assault. Going back to, I'm going back in time. In 2011, NATO attacked Libya. And this is one of the 50,000 sorties that were flown against Libya. As you can see, this is a city. This is a civilian target. And it's quite possible that this was a Canadian sortie. Canadian CF-18 jets flew about 20% of all the NATO attacks on Libya. And in fact, the Canadian military brass, you can check it on Canadian press, they joked about how Canada was the Air Force, NATO was the Air Force, including Canada, for Al-Qaeda, because the troops on the ground overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, his government, were basically Al-Qaeda. And when the damage was over, all the major cities in the western part of Libya were destroyed, and so was the state. It's now a failed state. There is no unified central government, and it's a system. It's chaotic, and millions of Libyans have sold everything they had and bought places on these crowded boats and have been trying to get across the Mediterranean into Europe. So this war, which is part of the war on terror, has destroyed a whole country and left it in chaos and created a humanitarian crisis, which has resulted in a refugee crisis. And the rationale that the United Nations used for this was the responsibility to protect, the newest form of humanitarian interventionism, which was developed in Canada at the Monk School at the University of Toronto, and later sold by our Prime Minister to the United Nations in 1999, and it was adopted in 2005. Allegedly, Gaddafi was abusing the civilians in Libya. Nothing was ever proven. But that was enough to get NATO in there to destroy the country, to seize and privatize the vast oil reserves, and to destroy a country. I presented this lecture at the Canadian Peace Science Convention back in 2014, and I have presented it in a number of places, and I discussed how this myth was created based on the British Empire's white man's burden to civilize the world according to its own image. We've also been in continuous opposition to the Canadian occupation of Kandahar province, which only ended
I think it was last year and a half ago. The Canadian troops were in Afghanistan as part of a NATO operation for altogether, I think, 12 or 13 years. 150 Canadians were killed. Nobody knows how many Afghanis were killed because nobody bothered to keep count. They don't count. Only the 150 Canadians counted. $25 billion of your tax money was spent so far, and there's still lots of soldiers left with PTSD and other injuries. So it's a continuing cost. And nothing was achieved. Absolutely nothing was achieved in Afghanistan. It was a completely failed war, which yet continues with American troops being increased last month to about 12,000. Part of our support work was for Homer Carter. This was a sort of political theater we had in Hamilton's Art Crawl several years ago before he was released, showing the inhuman and illegal treatment of the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, including Omar Khadr. Okay. By the way, the person speaking in that this is Eve Angler. He is a Canadian. He is someone who travels around Canada. I'm sure he comes here every year because he goes on a tour every year with a new book. I have a couple of his books about Canada's role in creating the Palestinian crisis back in 1947-48. It's a very good book. If you want to get it, it's $10. Okay, we were also involved in the opposition to overthrow the government, the first elected democratic government in Haiti in 200 years, the government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and this is the delegation that went from Canada to the World Social Forum. My son was in that picture somewhere. It was to participate in the condemnation and to try to get Jean-Paul Aristide back into power in Haiti. The plot to overthrow Jean-Bertrand Aristide was hatched in Ottawa. Hatched in Ottawa in 2003 by the British, the Americans, and our Canadian government at the time, which I think was a liberal government. I'm sure it was a liberal government. And so Aristide was overthrown, and all of the reforms that he brought in were disposed of, and now he is living in exile in South Africa. I believe, maybe Angola, somewhere in South Africa. And this is how he got started. This is the opposition to the Anglo-American attack on Iraq 2003, which caused most of the problems we now see in the Middle East. It destroyed the state of Iraq. The Americans are in the process next week of holding a plebiscite to create a sovereign Kurdish state in the north, so as to break up the country of Iraq. Iraq had the highest standard of living of any country in Asia. Had free tuition, free medical care, and all that was destroyed. The oil industry was privatized by the multinational corporations. A power vacuum was created which allowed Al-Qaeda and ISIS into Iraq. So this was a major war crime of huge proportions. It was not supported by the United Nations. The Canadian government did not participate in this attack, thanks to demonstrations that the Canadian Peace Alliance organized across the country. I was at one in Toronto. It was about 150,000 people. There was one in Montreal, 250,000 people. In Ottawa, about 95,000 people. So Jean Chrétien decided, he looked out his window in Parliament Hill and said, not supported by the United Nations Security Council. There are millions of people in the street in Canada. I think I'll give it a pass. Which was a good thing. that was where we started, and today we are also involved in support for Venezuela, which is under attack by the United States, and who has got slapped economic sanctions on it, and is working with extreme right-wing elements to try and stabilize Venezuela, and it's a regime change operation. It's a regime change operation. They supported an attack on Hugo Chavez, the charismatic leader of Venezuela, who brought about the Bolivarian Revolution, which uses the oil reserves, oil money, to ameliorate the lives of the people in Venezuela. That's not what the American government wants, and so they are trying to change it, bring about regime change. And at the same time, everybody in the world is sitting on pins and needles because there's a standoff between North Korea and the United States over North Korea's nuclear arms. And I could say a lot about that, but the main thing is, of course, that there should not be such a thing as nuclear arms. And the Canadian government played a very dirty role in this, in that it failed to participate last fall in the negotiations which took place at the United Nations involving 122 countries to create a treaty to ban all nuclear weapons, which is another way of saying it was a treaty for nuclear disarmament. When the vote came up in New York at the United Nations this spring, Canada voted against the treaty. And so Canada's vote has really been very bad, very poor, and we hope to change Canada's role. There are peace groups who are trying. The signing ceremony takes place tomorrow in New York City, and there's going to be informal signing ceremonies across Canada in the next few weeks to try and where citizens come and sign the treaty. And we hope we can put pressure on the Canadian government to sign the treaty. But here, to put it bluntly, Kim Il-jung has learned, he looked at, and his government looked at Iraq, where Saddam Hussein gave up his weapons of mass destruction, and the United States and NATO came in and destroyed the country. And he looked at Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction, the United States came in and destroyed the country. So the lesson he drew was that the United States only attacks countries without weapons of mass destruction, and that's why he's building a bomb. And of course, the United States has 7,000 nuclear weapons, huge weapons. Now, each one thousands of times more powerful than what hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's utterly hypocritical for the United States to complain about North Korea creating a nuclear weapon. But hopefully there will be, the Chinese are calling for negotiations between the United States and North Korea. One of the things that they could resolve very simply is put an end to the Korean War, which Canada participated in. It ended in 1953, but there's never been an armistice. So the war still continues. That's part of the reason that there is this confrontation between the United States and North Korea. And so I think the Chinese are right, that diplomacy is the way to go. And I think that's it. So thank you very much. We encourage people, you're all welcome to come and join our activities, which we have over the year. We have an executive, if anybody is interested in participating more fully. And if you have any questions, the books are for sale. I've given you some reading material. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer.
You can take that home.
Yes.
Different world perspectives on this thing. Right? You talked about, I noticed like when I travel to Europe or whatever, and I go somewhere and I turn on the TV and I watch that, I go, this is a completely different world. Right? I mean, I get that they have a completely different perspective, completely different priorities. The most mysterious one to me is China, because they have to be an incredibly huge player we don't have a clue what they think. Do you have any idea? Like in this North Korea thing, right? I'm going, what's China's take on all of this?
Well, China's take is what they said, the government of China said yesterday, is that the United States should cease its bellicose rhetoric against North Korea immediately and should sit down in face-to-face negotiations with North Korea about its nuclear program. And what they're saying is, what the suggestion is that the United States and North Korea should agree as a first step for a freeze and a freeze. That is to say that North Korea freezes its atomic program at the level it's at now, and the United States freezes its program at the level it's at now. And that further negotiations take place over what the role of the United States is in South Korea. You may not be aware, you won't be aware from the mainstream media, that the United States maintains a permanent army of 30,000 soldiers in South Korea. And every year it has military drills, exercises, right along the line of control between North and South Korea, where they have hundreds of thousands of soldiers from South Korea and the United States engaged in all kinds of military exercises right on the border, with planes and tanks and ships and missiles and everything else. This year there was the added component that the military exercises were also to have a separate unit which was supposed to be a decapitation unit, which was supposed to be it was supposed to be the unit that killed the government leaders of North Korea. Now, under the United Nations Charter, you're not allowed even to threaten another country with military action. Can you imagine if North Korea had military exercises on the, somewhere in northern Mexico with the threat of decapitating the government in Washington, or maybe in Saskatchewan? Can you imagine that the Americans allowing that to happen? But they do this every year, and there's nothing to stop them from turning one of these military exercises in a moment's notice into the real thing. So every year, this time of year, there is this blow-up between North Korea and the United States. And you can imagine why if you were North Korea. During the Korean War, there was no building left standing in North Korea. They bombed it so heavily, there was no building over 2 stories left standing in North Korea. 20% of all North Koreans were killed in the bombing. So the North Koreans have a very big grudge and a very big fear of the United States. And they do not want to be invaded. And they looked at Libya, and they looked at Iraq, and they said, what is our best guarantee of not being invaded and overthrown? And that is having a nuclear capacity where we could damage the United States. And frankly, under the system of international politics that we have now, it makes sense. Unfortunately.
So that incident in Mogadishu is Black Hawk Down. Did you follow military intervention?
Yes.
What's the details behind that then?
Well,
because it went sour. What's your view on it?
Well, the United States and Canada have been playing a dirty role in Somalia over the years. You may remember that the Canadian Army was in Somalia, and they laid traps for Somali kids, and they tortured them inside a Canadian military base. And Jean Chrétien had to demobilize. He had to get rid of the unit, the commando unit, altogether. He just got rid of it, and they had to create a new commando structure in Canada. So this has been going on since the 90s, I believe, 80s or 90s. If you remember, if you want to Google General Wesley Clark, U.S. General Wesley Clark, there's a famous YouTube video of him, and the story goes like this. It's 1 month after 9/11,
and General Wesley Clark was called out of retirement to serve back to the Pentagon. He gets back, he opens the door, goes right in, he's just going inside the Pentagon, and one of his former fellow generals comes up to him and says, "Hi, Wesley, did you hear the latest?" This is 1 month after, this is October 2001. He says, "Guess what?" I said, "What?" "The plan is we are going to invade 7 countries in the next 5 years." And he lists the countries. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, no, I think it was Yemen. I'm missing one. But anyway.
Kuwait?
Huh?
Kuwait?
No, Kuwait is part of the cabal. Part of the, there's a U.S. military and British military base there. And the only, Clark was astounded, but as it turned out, they invaded 6 of those 7 countries. Somalia was one of them. I hope that answers your question.
No, I mean, the hand-wringing that went on after this Black Hawk Down thing was that prior to that, there was plans to help the Somalis.
We are always helping these people.
And they're sort of saying, well, what happened? We went in with good intentions.
Yes, they have the best of intentions. It's called humanitarian interventionism. We're there to protect the human rights of the government, the human rights of the people against bad governments.
Okay, so something like that did happen, but how was it viewed by the Somalis?
The Somalis regard it as what, the Black Hawk Down?
No.
About
prior
their
to that, with the people coming in and trying to help them.
There's always people in these countries who are, it's usually the elites, or some of the elites, that help the Americans come in. They stand up publicly at the UN or say, we need your help. But they don't represent the majority of the people. These are usually expats. During the build up to the attack on Iraq, there were defectors, people who'd left the government and the politics of Iraq, who said, "Oh, Saddam Hussein is a terrible dictator. He's doing this and he's doing that. You should come in and fix that." And so that was the Americans and the British, put them up on TV and in the newspaper, and they used them as a justification. And the same thing happened in Libya. Defectors from the government and from the military would say, "Oh, he says Gaddafi is just terrible." Meanwhile, Gaddafi's Libya had the highest standard of living in all of Africa. Women and men could go to the highest position, free education, free tuition, right to the end of the university. There's thousands of doctors. There's hundreds of doctors in Canada, Libyan doctors who were trained here by government funds from Libya, and instead of going back to Libya, they stayed here. But that's the kind of thing they used a vast oil wealth to benefit the Libyan people. And but there are always people in these countries who have access to grind and are used by as spokespeople to say we need to invade this country because the human rights of the people are being abused. Yes.
It seems similar when the Americans were goading Cuba and just sort of daring them to fire. I mean, I saw a really good documentary where they were flying so low, and the Cubans held their camp. They didn't shoot. It's like they're goading the North Koreans to do something so they can go in and blast them. It's a typical American thing. If we don't beat you, we don't like you.
Yeah,
there's a lingering thing against Cuba and North Korea, whereas Japan and Germany, they're doing great.
Right.
Same old.
And the Americans can keep in power all over the world the most bloody dictators who really abuse the human rights of people, like Pinochet and the Shah of Iran, the government of Israel, which tremendous abusers of human rights, but they're okay. They're okay. It's only when they have their eyes on a certain prize in a country that is not in their sphere of influence, like Syria or Libya, they decide to move against that country. Yes?
Outside of, I guess the extreme for Canada would be complete isolationism, where we stop participating in anything the United States does, and just hunker down here in the Great White North. How do we fit into this mess? And I think we all agree that the Americans are quick to the trigger and paying more to them. But there's got to be a role that Canada can take, given that we're a minor power, and yet not be involved with this empirical.
Yes, and that role, the first thing that Canada, the government of Canada should do is drop out of NATO. As a member of NATO, we are dragged into each and every war of the empire. And the NATO, Canada under Lester B. Pearson, by the way, helped to create NATO in the first place. It wasn't peacekeeping, according to Engler, whose little book is there, that Lester B. Pearson thought was his greatest lifetime achievement. It was creating NATO, believe it or not. You would be surprised about that. I was. NATO, if Canada were to get out of NATO, we could play the role that most Canadians would like us to play, and that is to be power that works as a middle power independently of other governments, that has its own independent foreign policy, that uses its good international reputation for peacekeeping, for diplomacy, for finding solutions between the great powers. Canada could play a very useful and productive role. We could even go as far as joining the non-aligned movement, along with countries like India and the former Yugoslavia, who created countries in Africa that are trying not to be part of one great power sphere of influence or another. So I think that the precondition for Canada playing a positive role in the world in the future is getting out of NATO.
In other words, what you're saying is NATO, the original purpose of which was to defend against the Iron Curtain countries,
right,
is pretty much gone.
Yeah.
So I'm.
Yes, Canada, the original purpose of NATO was to be a military alliance against the Soviet Union. There is no Soviet Union. And NATO has since then spread much farther since the end of the Soviet Union than it did before. Before it confined itself largely to the North Atlantic. Now NATO is in Africa, NATO is in Asia, NATO is in South America. NATO has been involved in all these wars that I've just told you about in one form or another. So Canada would be wise to get out of NATO and develop an independent foreign policy.
How is that going to affect our economic relationship with the United States? I understand we're under their economic thumb.
I'm sure it would, but we are always having economic problems with the United States anyway. Look at the softwood lumber, for example, or the beef, the problems over Canadian beef. Right now, Trump is trying to what's the word? Not cancel, renege, and NAFTA because he doesn't like it. So we always have these problems with the Americans. And so if we decided not to be part of NATO, I guess there would be problems there too. But there's a big world out there. You can also trade with other countries. It doesn't have to be the United States if they don't want to play ball.
The biggest problem you have there is to convince Canadian businessmen to follow you, because it's just so easy to ship things to the United States. Getting them to diversify and tackle other markets has been something the government's trying to do for years. They're really resistant because the economic flow is naturally known. This country is like a bumblebee. It should never have happened the way it did, theoretically. It's all the economic
Go north and south.
Go north and south. Why is British Columbia trying to get into the Ontario wine business? It doesn't make any sense. Sell it to Seattle. that's one of the biggest problems we have, is that we have that sort of default ship it to the Americans attitude among Canadian businesses. And bear in mind that the definition of an entrepreneur in Canada is the first person in line for a government grant. But that's, so we need to wrestle with that internally as well. It's not as easy as just saying, oh, we'll get a NATO and that'll solve the problem. We have to evolve a great deal more in terms of sovereignty as a nation.
That's true, but sovereignty is the key to it. Under NATO, we are, I think, losing our sovereignty little by little, and not for a beneficial effect. That's because the Americans don't recognize the sovereignty of other countries except their own. They didn't recognize the sovereignty of Libya, didn't recognize the sovereignty of Syria, of Iraq. And they just don't. For them, there's only one exceptional country, indispensable. I'm quoting Obama here, okay, and Clinton. They are indispensable and exceptional. They are the ones that have sovereignty. Nobody else does. They spy on all the leaders of their allies in Western Europe, a Canadian general just reported yesterday or Friday that the Americans, he reported in the Canadian government that if there is a war and we're supposed to be protected under NATO's nuclear umbrella, the American priority is to protect America. They may or they may not protect Canada. So, I mean, that's in it for us.
Well, that's the public relations job that the Canadian government and the American government have done, is to ignore it, which is another organization that we defend us against the Soviet Union, and it is obsolete.
Yeah. Absolutely obsolete.
Basically, Canada doesn't have any defense for them coming in from outside their borders.
And that's a good thing.
Really did.
I think that's a good thing.
Well, the Americans wanted us to stop the missiles over Canada instead of the United States, so we were buffers. There's a great guy named, there's a journalist in Washington, I remember his name is McGaffey. He wrote a book called Peacemaker or Powder Monkey. This is in the 1970s. You must read and understand the real relationship militarily between Canada and the United States. We were to do one single thing, go and buy our new jets from someone else. The United States would be absolutely bulletproof.
Absolutely.
Because they would not have control over them.
So, I mean, all of these conflicts, I mean, if we look at them all, right, they're really about power and control.
Power and money.
Control, right? Money is, in my mind, money is just another word for control, right? But because money's just a tool to control people, right? What they really, because they have enough money, right? They want control.
When you mean they,
and they as in all parties, both sides.
Well,
right?
I don't know who the other sides are. I know the United States,
Syria as a country wants its own control as well.
That's different. That's legal. That's called national sovereignty, and it's protected. That's the fundamental of international law and the United Nations Charter. That countries have sovereignty, and they should be respected, whether they're big or small. Okay. The United States, officially, in many different publications, has put out the fact that it wants to dominate the world.
Yes.
It's called hegemony. Yeah. Basically, it wants to rule the world and defeat any opposition. They make it very clear in government documents,
Yes.
So, what was your question?
Well, going back to the power, right?
Yeah.
And to me, if there's a message to get out there, right? The message is that your need for power, right? The need for power comes down to I have the answer, right? Everybody thinks I have the answer. When you have two sides going to war, they both believe they're right. One doesn't believe it's wrong, and the other one believes it's right. They both believe they're right. Right? They both believe I have the answer. And if we look historically back at every major screw-up in history, it all goes back to somebody thought they had the answer. Right? There aren't any people in the world going, I don't know the answer. Right? And to me, the question is, why aren't we asking that? Do you really know the answer? Does anybody know the answer? Like, because what happens is, this is the answer. No, this is the answer. No, that's the answer. No, this is the answer. And nobody's going, I don't know the answer.
Well, I'll tell you something very interesting about the Syrian war. The Americans, NATO, the Arab monarchs, said that they're going into Syria because it's a terrible dictator, killing his own people, blah, blah, blah. And for the first time, thanks to social media, people, independent journalists such as Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett comes from Erin, Ontario. She and Vanessa Beeley and other people like that were able to expose the lies. You know, when the Americans said there's a massacre at this place, they went there and they actually talked to the people. No, it was the terrorists who assassinated a whole bunch of people. When they had this group called the White Helmets, which were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, they actually went and examined who were the White Helmets. The White Helmets are an arm of Al Qaeda in Syria. They are a paramilitary operation funded by MI6. Their leader is John Zurier, who was a former British officer, and the money for the White Helmets, about $100 million, was funded by USA, the MI6 in England, the Dutch government, various other governments, and it was to create this false notion of an emergency first responders going in and saving people from the terrible barrel bombs of the Syrian government. And all the people like Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett showed, you know, using their own information and by talking to people and going to Syria like as I did and talking to people, that the White Helmets are often seen carrying guns, and they change uniforms. One minute they're terrorist mercenaries killing people, like postal workers in Syria, or transport workers. 12,000 members of the General Federation of Trade Unions in Syria were killed by these terrorists because they worked for the government and they were trying to deliver mail, keep the phone lines going, or something like that. Assassinated, pushed off the tops of buildings, post offices, and things like that. You can see it on YouTube because they videoed themselves doing it. So they exposed the White Helmets, and they didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, this is the first war in history where the lies of the aggressor were exposed while the war was going on. So this is something completely new. And I'm really glad we have the social media, because nobody would have heard about all this stuff. As I was saying to you, whenever these terrorists came into a city and, you know, assassinated the people who worked for the government, or people who belonged to the governing party, the Ba'ath Party, or killed workers working for them and so on, or people who were of a different religion than them, the survivors didn't stay there. They left en masse and they ran to government-held areas. And of course, you would never hear that in the Western media. This is shown by people who went in there. And these terrorists never allow elections in areas where they hold power. All these things were exposed. All the lies that were used to justify the war, all the rationale. So I think that you asked, how do we find out the real reasons? Well, now there's a way. There are independent journalists out there working for independent firms who are actually in the war zone, and they're exposing the pretext for these wars.
I think that you're on Chomsky now.
I used to be, but he ended up supporting the intervention in Syria, the Western intervention in Syria. I used to be. He also supported the Western intervention against Libya. festival?
Gandhi.
Oh, okay. Well, if you're interested, it's not something we run, but we're participating in. There's a Gandhi Peace Festival in Hamilton on September the 30th, 1 to 5 at Hamilton City Hall. They have it every year. I think this is number 25. It's they have a little march through the downtown. They have many speakers. This is going to be a little different because a neo-fascist group called the Soldiers of Odin threatened to have a demonstration in City Hall Square at exactly the same time as the Peace Festival this year. So we don't know what's going to happen.
So it's moving here, this craziness.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
It's not moving here, it's been here forever.
I know, but these have these double meetings on the same day so that we can cause
You want to go and visit the original headquarters of the KKK in Canada, you just go to the school.
Let's go.
Yeah.
They have KKK in Canada?
Right? Yeah. Oh yeah.
They have KKK in Canada?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know these things both existed, but it's always public conference.
Okay, so the only thing I would like to end up with is saying we do have a website. It's called Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War.ca. You can go to it, or hcsw.ca. And we have a Facebook page, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. And you can get your information there. And of course you can get your information by reading some of the materials I've brought along. Thank you very much for hosting me today.